Good afternoon, I'm Vince Godinich. Let's back this up just a minute. There we go. I'm going to do a quick presentation this afternoon on establishing VPNs. Old topic, everybody's probably done it, but what I've found in my business is that I go into networks and a lot of people have Cisco devices out there. They're expensive, everybody knows that. What I tried to do is instead of selling an entire new system to them, I'll integrate one MikroTik at a time to them. And that's what I'm going to attempt to explain how I do things. What we'll do, first off, I have, just my experience, I've built wireless ISPs, I've done a lot of networking and stuff like that over the last 15 years or so. But what I'm going to show you today is basically just substituting a MikroTik router for a Cisco device. First example would be a Pptp client to a Cisco server. These are all examples of stuff I've done with clients. This one, the guy had a Cisco server in place at a head end, so to speak. And he had a Pptp client, Cisco's all over the place. As one of them needed replacement, I went in, replaced it with the MikroTik, showed them what it could do, show them it's compatible, and we built from there. The second examples I'll give you, I use what's called a Shrew client. It takes the place of the native Windows client, and I'll show you in a minute. It also will take the place of a Cisco VPN client. And then last, I'll show you a couple examples of how we can substitute a MikroTik device to connect back to either a Cisco router or a Cisco ASA. And again, these examples I'm going to give you are pretty simple. We're dealing with VPNs, we're dealing with encryptions. It can get very complicated very quick. I've tried to make this presentation simple. Depending on the application, obviously you'd probably want better security, better encryption measures on an actual deployment. Again, it depends on what your customer is going to be doing. It's kind of like what I've already said, and again, the point I'm trying to make is just substituting MikroTik routers for Cisco devices one at a time throughout a network so a customer doesn't have to do a forklift upgrade, so to speak. First example would be pretty simple. We have a Cisco router that's acting as a Pptp server. I'm going to come in and establish a MikroTik router as the Pptp client. Again, this is strictly a lab type environment. Again, it's real simple. Just establish the PPT tunnel between the router, MikroTik router, and the Cisco router. Pretty simple. First step is we'll just configure the MikroTik. Now I'm assuming in this case that we have IP connectivity already established. I didn't want to go into all of that today. First thing is real simple on the MikroTik PPP. We're going to build, add an interface, PPP client, go through it, name it whatever you want to name it. I just left it as default. Next, we'll go into the dial out tab. Connect to, that's your remote Cisco device across the internet, across whatever you're doing. Username and password is the Pptp username and password that we're going to establish. Profile will be default encryption. Down here we can allow whatever we want. We'll just use chap 2 to start with here. Next tab we go over. What we'll need to do here, we'll just establish the default profile. Again, we're going to leave everything pretty much default as it is. It's pretty simple. The only thing I've really changed on this is we'll require encryption to take place across the tunnel down here on the bottom under protocols. You can come in here and play with all these advanced things if you want to, but again, we're just trying to keep it simple today. The next thing we'll have to do on the MikroTik is to do some NAT bypass. What we're trying to accomplish here is that I'm assuming we have masquerading set up on the MikroTik. It's a branch location. We have to make sure we bypass that NAT translation for any traffic we're wanting to send to the main office LAN or the remote LAN. And we just go IP firewall NAT. We go in, we add a rule. We're source NATing. Destination address we're identifying, that's your remote LAN that you're going to be connecting to across the tunnel. The outbound interface is the interface, your WAN interface on your MikroTik. And we're going to accept, under Action tab, we're going to accept that traffic. In other words, we're not going to NAT that traffic. The biggest thing to remember here, let me back up, which mistake's pretty common. You have to move this rule up above your masquerade rule in your NAT firewall rules. It has to come first. In other words, we're going to identify that remote traffic. We're going to exempt it from NATing. If it doesn't match that rule, then all of your remaining internet, so to speak, traffic will be NATed at that point. So we have to make sure that we do exempt that traffic. Once that's set up, the Cisco server, I'm not going to get into a Cisco class. I'm just going to give you some basic command line about what's going on the Cisco server. These are some of the basic commands you have to set up on that. AAA authentication is, we're doing default local. That means your username and password. On the Cisco, obviously has to match which on the MikroTik that we plugged in on the GUI. The VPDN, we're enabling it. We're setting up the group. Again, pretty much the same thing we did on the MikroTik. It's just a different type of setup if anybody's not familiar with Cisco. Setting up a virtual template. We're identifying the IP address of the Pptp tunnel. And again, that's a different IP address and a different subnet of both the remote and the local networks. We're setting up a third subnet actually for that tunnel. We're going to give out, this is the Cisco server. The Pptp server will be giving out an address to the client, which would be the MikroTik router. That's how you do this. You set up an address pool. I've set it up as 192.168.79.2. That just means there's a single address in that pool. That can be the biggest subnet as you need if you have multiple clients. You set your encryption, your authentication, all pretty simple. Again, we have to do some NAT bypass on the Cisco side also, because again, it's a point-to-point tunnel. And that's pretty much it on the Cisco side. I know it's real simple, getting to a lot more complicated scenarios, but once you set it up, side A with the MikroTik, we're going to just ping the remote server over here, and the tunnel works. Again, real simple setup. A couple of ways you can determine whether that tunnel is actually up or not if you're having trouble. You can go into the MikroTik. As you can see, we've got if you go into IP routes, you can see some dynamic routes that have been set up. The 79.1, and that is a point-to-point network route set up. Over here, you picked up a dynamic address. That's the point-to-point tunnel coming from the Cisco, gave that address out. And then you can always go into the interface, and you can see if that interface is up and running or not. That's the easiest way to see if that tunnel is up and established. That'd be the first thing you want to check in case you can't ping that remote server or do something like that. Let's make sure the tunnel's working. Again, if you disable that tunnel, just gave you a little bit of example here, you can't ping. Tunnel's down, it's not going to work. On the here's the command line that you can use on the MikroTik if you'd like to do it by command line. Same thing we did with the GUI. And that's pretty much it on that. Again, real simple Pptp tunnel between a MikroTik and and a Cisco server. You can reverse them if you want. Have the MikroTik to be the Pptp server, and you can have a Cisco or any, I'm talking Cisco here, but you can have any other third-party device. You name it, and if you dig into it, you can pretty much come up with and have MikroTik substitute for one of those devices, and that's the whole point of what I'm trying to do. The next thing I'm going to cover is to set up a client on your laptop in order to connect back over to IPsec tunnels. I'm not a Windows guy, I'm not a computer guy, but I've noticed lately that you use the native VPN built-in stuff on Windows, you get it to work, and every time Windows updates itself, they seem to crash, and you have to go back and reconfigure everything. Maybe that's me, I don't know. I don't know. It seems like every time I do something to get something working and Windows doesn't update, it doesn't work the next morning. My solution to this has been just using the Shrew client. There's a bunch of them out there. I just picked this one and used it. You don't have to use anything native on the Windows. You can get the same client, to work on any number of different operating systems also. I have a customer out there, they still use the Cisco VPN Client. I think it's outdated, everything, but they're still using it. They don't want to change it. I tried to set up some IPsec tunnels for their remote access on their stuff, and they said, well, I have to have 2 clients. Or with this, I'll show you in a minute, you can import those profiles from the Cisco VPN Client right into this. It works fine. Use one client, you can connect to any IP, but MikroTik, Cisco VPN tunnels, Cisco ASAs, you can connect them all and replace that VPN client so you only have to have one client on your laptop. And again, I use this, again, have MikroTik devices, Cisco devices, use the same client for both. You can migrate over to a pure MikroTik environment, which has been my ultimate goal on a lot of the clients I work with. Again, real simple scenario. You have a remote PC out here, little network simulating the internet, and then you have a server you need to get to on the other end. You're going to set up an IPsec tunnel here. First thing, I'm going to just show you how to set this up back to the MikroTik, a MikroTik server to start with. IP, first thing we'll do is set up a remote access address pool. It's pretty simple. You set your pool up. You go into IPsec. First thing we'll do is just set up a default group. I call it RW. It seems to be what people call it. You can name it whatever you want. Next, we'll set a policy up. We have to identify our local traffic. And then again, the point 3 is the tunnel traffic. That's the actual tunnel interfaces. We set those up. We're just identifying what traffic we want to encrypt each way on the tunnel. That's all we're doing here. Hardest thing to remember here is what your local networks, what your remote networks are, and stuff like that. Once we get that, the action, we're going to encrypt it. You can specify any number of different things here. Anybody ever dealt with VPN tunnels and IPsec, there's a million different possibilities for algorithms, encryptions, or whatever. You just have to pick what's going to work for you, depending on what security level you need or your client requires. Next, we're going to set the policy up. Again, the source and destination addresses. This is the tunnel subnet. That's the remote LAN or the LAN at the main behind your server that you're trying to connect to. You specify the group that we specified earlier. Next, we'll set a peer up. Our peer up here, again, this is for remote access. We have no idea what that IP address may be. You may be here tonight, you may be somewhere else tomorrow, so that's pretty standard. We're going to just use pre-share keys here just to make it simple for the demonstration. Simple pre-share secrets. And you have to just make sure that this all matches your exchange mode, your proposal checks, hash algorithms, your encryptions. You just go right down the line. My biggest problem, and I'm sure a lot of other people's trying to get IPsec tunnels and stuff to work, is to make sure all this stuff is the same on both ends. That seems to be the hardest part. So as long as it's the same on the other end, it should work and it's compatible. Same thing here. We're just doing configure our mode configs. This is the split includes. This is your remote subnet that you want to reach on the other end. At your head end, you can specify, you may have multiple subnets at that home office, and you only want this remote client to access one of those subnets. That's where you'd specify it here. You can add them or delete them or specify what they need to access as a general rule. And the same thing on your proposals, just pick the algorithms and encryption algorithm, authentication algorithms, make sure your lifetimes are going to be the same on both sides, etc. So it's all pretty straightforward. The client, just download here. This is just one of many clients that you can get out there. Just run real quick. Once you install the client, you can see I've got a bunch of these different ones set up. I've just set up this test one. Just pretty much go through the add box, general. Again, the host name, that's the IP address of the network, the WAN network you're trying to get to. Client, I've left a lot of these I've just disabled for simplicity purposes of this. You can configure this however you need to configure it. It's all pretty straightforward. I've disabled all the WINs and DNS and stuff like that. It's all pretty straightforward. The authentication will be mutual pre-shared key. Put your pre-shared key in here. This is your phase 1, some people call it phase 2, IPsec or IKE. Just make sure that these parameters meet what you set up on your server. That's the most important part. And again, this is your policy. This is what you're trying to access, your remote LAN. And it's real simple. Once you get it set up, you click that, you click connect, and it connects, it works, as long as everything's set up. What's good about this particular client, you can export the configuration. This is just a text file, what it looks like. You can save it, email it to somebody, very easily import it back into another client somewhere else. You can either import it or export it. It's kind of hard to see here, but I've actually imported a Cisco VPN Client profile into this, and I've actually used that, just export it right in, click it, and it works. It's a .pfc file on the Cisco client side. Once you connect, it brings up the little dialog, and everything's connected. And you can ping that remote server, and it works. And again, the reason why I've used this, again, is does anybody else have any trouble with what I was talking about, the MikroTik native stuff just not working sometime? Maybe it's just me, but I've had several clients tell me that they just set things up, and once Windows updates, they go to upgrade to a new version of Windows, things don't work, and they have to start all over again. This works pretty much on every brand of Windows and Linux you can find out there. Next, we're going to do just a typical point-to-point IPsec tunnel between either a Cisco router, just running the normal iOS stuff. I used a little 1800 series in this demonstration, or an ASA. I think I used 5505 ASA in this, back to a MikroTik router device. And again, the purpose of all this is to replace that expensive Cisco stuff when you're dealing with a client. Get it in there, get one of these little black boxes called MikroTik that a lot of people are scared to death about out there. You plug it into a remote branch, you show it that it works, you show them the price tag of it, install it, it's compatible with their Cisco main server, and it just works. I've had one example And sometimes, even if a client wants to go all to MikroTik, sometimes they're restricted. I had a client that was actually they were a small telephone company, and they had a Cisco, I think it was a 7206 router. They had a huge investment in it. And the biggest reason they needed to keep it was because of the ATM interface they had back to a bunch of legacy DSL equipment they had running. And so they had to keep that. It was just easy. They wanted to keep it. Let's put it that way. They didn't want to have to go through having to reconfigure that entire system. So we just put some MikroTiks out on there, a couple little remote areas, and tied right back into that server. It worked good. Here's a little graphic of what we'll be doing. Again, pretty simple, just for explanation. Same basic thing we went through before, IP, IPsec. That's how you get there in the GUI. We'll do a policy. Again, source address, destination. Again, these are the local, this is a point-to-point tunnel. So just the source, local LAN, remote LANs we're connecting to. Just make sure you get them in the right order, it won't work. The action, again, we're going to encrypt it, require encryption. There's your different protocols. These are the local WAN address, remote WAN address. I think this is all pretty simple. Go into your peers, configure your peer. Again, we'll have an actual address compared to the last one where we didn't know, because again, this is permanent addresses on both ends. Again, pretty simple. Just make sure that this is going to match what you're going to put in on the other end. Same thing under your proposal. Again, local and remote, we have to create that NAT rule again, that NAT bypass again. We're determining what traffic is going to traverse that tunnel so it doesn't get NATed and sent out to the internet. And again, we're going to accept that on the NAT rules and make sure that that rule is placed above your other masquerade rule in your rule set there. This is what the config would look like on the Cisco side. And again, this isn't really a Cisco class, but it's basically the same thing. Here's your key, there's your pre-shared key, there's your remote address. Again, it's a mirror of what we put in on the MikroTik. Specify your encryption, your group. And again, it just goes through this. Your transform sets, your remote peers. You have to enable it on that specific interface. And again, you have to exclude it on the NAT on the Cisco side too if you're doing it that way. So that's just a quick example of what additional configs you need on the Cisco stuff. Once you get it up and running, you can start passing traffic. You check it on the MikroTik side, the same as I showed you a while ago. On the Cisco side, on the router, you can issue that show crypto, ISACMP, that's a security association. It should pop it up there that it's an active SA, source at the destination, source address. That's one way to check. And this is your phase 1. To check phase 2, you have to do the Ipsec SA on your Cisco. And it spits out about 10 pages worth of stuff, but you can pretty much tell if that tunnel's up or not. That's the easiest way to tell if it's working on the Cisco side. Status active, tells you all the specifics about it. And that's pretty much it on the router. It's pretty simple to do. Again, just make sure you have the same configuration on both sides. This next quick example will be with an ASA. Back to a MikroTik. Go through this. It's pretty much the same as what we did before. The IP addresses are just a little bit different in this example, but the same basic thing we did with the router. You could use the same configuration, really, that you use for a router. Connecting to a Cisco router on the MikroTik side, you use the same thing to an ASA. Let's go through that real quick. Make sure all your specifications are in there. On the Cisco ASA side, I've used the ASDM, they call it. It's the web-based interface to the new Cisco ASAs. Good and bad, okay? It's good because you'll see it's about a 4 or 5 step process, and you can set up that tunnel. I'll explain to you a little bit about what I personally think is the bad side of using a GUI wizard like this to set it up. But to do it, you just go to Wizard, site-to-site VPN Wizard, press the button, and it takes you through it. Make sure you want a site-to-site VPN set up. Remote address, that's the address of your MikroTik. What interface you want it set up on. Local remote networks. Type in your pre-share key. We want to exempt this is your NAT bypass. And you finish it. You press the button and it's done. Okay, that's the good side about it. My opinion, the bad side about it is when you look at it, look at all you've pretty much configured every combination in the world through that wizard that you can connect back to that thing with. I prefer in a real environment, you go back, not to use the wizard. Of course, you have to know enough about Cisco to do that if you're doing it on their side. Specify what you want. If not, you get a whole bunch of stuff in there that may or may not be good. That's just my personal opinion about this. If you're going to set up an IPsec tunnel, do it the same on both ends. Specify your encryption that you want on both ends, and do it that way. Instead of having about 50 extra lines of configuration in there for troubleshooting, you get back in there and you don't really know what's going on where. So that would be, to me, one of the downsides of using this GUI to set it up. Again, once you set it up, you can go back under, look inside that the Cisco thing. Here's kind of a summary of what we did with that. And again, this is my biggest concern, all these different, they call them transfer set, all the different stuff that's in there. Sometimes it gets very difficult to troubleshoot when you don't really know which one you're using or you don't specify it. Again, you can look up sessions. There's our session up and running. It says it's up and active. There's all the information on the IPsec side, the IPsec and the IKE section. You can look at all that. Again, this is mainly for troubleshooting, verify the tunnel's up. Again, back on the MikroTik side, you can go under remote peers, IPsec remote peers, and that'll show up once that tunnel is there. If you don't have a tunnel there, it's not going to show up. And we can ping it. And again, on the MikroTik side, you can look for your installed SAs, and it should give you that source and destination. Back and forth. IPsec, you need 2 security associations to make it work. One for traffic going, totally separate tunnel for traffic coming back, is the way IPsec works. And we're pinging the other end. And that's really about all I've got. Again, the configurations of that are real simple in this case. Get into a real life situation, make sure you check with your client, see what their security requirements are. If you're trying to get back to a server that's got 500,000 credit card numbers on it, you better pay attention to a lot of stuff. If you're just trying to get back to a home network to where somebody can get in and check their email, you take that into consideration too. Any questions? Good. Thank you.